So, did you put your tomato plants out? Good. And not Basil either, I hope. Doesn't like the cold. This is my only high-tech stuff. I'm going to put my timer on so I don't go beyond my welcome limit. There. There was a girl once who lived in a tangly forest all by herself. And the only thing that she was afraid of were the snakes. And she built her nest out at the edges of the branches where the twigs were so narrow that even the snakes were terrified to come too close to her. And in her nest, she had some books, and she had some crochet work, and she had a harmonica. And what she liked to do more than anything else in all the world was play that harmonica. But the problem was, every time she played the harmonica, the snakes would wriggle as close as they could to the edge of her nest, and they would hiss angrily. Well, one afternoon, she was sitting in her nest playing her harmonica, and she had a different guest this time, not the snakes. It was a large brown spider, and he appeared to be clinging to a rope that descended from the clouds. And the spider said to the girl, how would you like to come and live with me in my palace, high above the clouds and away from all of these dangerous snakes? And the girl said, I would like that very much, but how do I get there? Oh, it's easy, he said. All you have to do is cling to my back and I'll take you there. And so the girl packed up her things in a cloth sack, and she stepped on the edge of the nest and she clung to the spider's back. And the spider began to roll a rope up between his legs, and he carried her higher and higher and higher. And eventually, they passed through the cloud layers, and as they emerged on the other side, there was a magnificent palace. And the girl gasped when she saw it. Now, it wasn't just the fact that the basement of this palace was higher than the highest mountaintop. The reason she gasped was because the palace was completely made out of glass. And as the girl crossed the threshold with the spider, she said, I think I'm gonna like it here. And she did. She really did. The spider let her go anywhere she wanted in the palace, and she loved to go up to the attic, and then she would lift the carpet, and she could look directly into the basement 10 stories beneath. And if she wasn't exploring the palace, the spider would let her go outside to play. And she loved to climb up those great big fluffy white clouds you sometimes see on a clear day. And then she would somersault down the clouds. And when clouds get inside your shirt collar, they tickle like crazy. She absolutely loved it. But on days when it was sort of dull and dreary and there wasn't a heavy cloud layer, she couldn't go outside to play because, you see, if she did, she'd just plunge right down. But there was lots to explore in the palace. Now, there was a routine. I mean, yes, she played a lot, but the spider and the girl had dinner together every night. And then always afterwards, he would conduct her to her room, and there he would read her a bedtime story. And after he said goodnight and went back downstairs, she would walk over the side of the bed, and she would always see him go back to the dining room. And he would take out a big fat cigar and light it, and he would smoke the cigar. And she loved to watch as the smoke rings were trapped by the glass ceiling and made a kind of a white haze across everything. And then even when all of the lights were turned out in the palace, she just had to lean back on her pillow, and there was the moon and the stars. Do you understand why she didn't get a lot of sleep in that place? Well, one day, it was not appropriate to go outside. The cloud layers were not thick enough. And today was the day The spider was going into that room. Did I tell you about that room? Did I? No? Well, there was one room in the palace that was different from all of the other rooms. You see, you couldn't see into it because there were heavy drapes that lined the walls. You couldn't look down into it because there were heavy drapes across the ceiling. You couldn't look up into it because the room was carpeted. Now, she was not forbidden to go there. She had been in many, many times, and it was a rather ordinary room, probably not much different from your living room at home. There was a sofa, a coffee table, some side chairs, lamps, things like that. But there was a mystery about the room, because you see, every week for 1 hour, the spider would enter that room and lock the door and remain there for about an hour, and then he would come out. Now the girl was desperately curious to know why he was doing this. What was going on in there? I suppose she could have asked him, but somehow she felt it wasn't right, that she was invading his privacy. And so she said nothing, but she knew that tonight he was going into that room. And she knew that tonight she had to get in there and find out what was going on. And so after dinner that night, the spider accompanied up to her bedroom. He read her a bedtime story, and then he went back downstairs, and as was his custom, went into the dining room, lit a big fat cigar, and the girl watched as the smoke began to gather along the glass ceiling. And then she crept out of bed, and she started down the stairs. Now, she had to be very careful, didn't she? I mean, if he looked up, he would have seen her, but he didn't. And she got to the room, dashed inside, and she scrunched under the sofa. And she waited, and she waited, and she waited. And then at last, she heard the door open. The spider entered. The door closed, and the lock clicked into place. Now, for the longest time, she just remained absolutely motionless. And then gradually, she began to crane her neck further and further until she could see out from underneath the sofa. And what she saw was this. The spider had turned into a man. Now, what puzzled her was this. He didn't look all that different as a man than he had as a spider. And she was trying to figure out, had he been born a spider and had the power to transform himself into a man? Or had he been born a man and somehow been enchanted and made into a spider? On the whole, she was quite confused. But also, on the whole, she felt very, very sorry that she had stuck into the room like this and spied on him. And moments later, she looked out again, and the man had turned back into the spider. And she heard the lock released, the door opened and closed, and she stayed there for quite a while to make sure that the spider had gone to his bedroom. And then eventually, she crawled out from under the sofa, opened the door, closed it quietly, dashed up to her room, leaned back on her pillow, and tried to think about everything that she had observed. In the morning, when she awoke, she was quite startled to realize that there was no light flooding her room. And when she sat up, she could see that during the night, the glass walls of the palace had been transformed into milk-white marble. She got out of bed. She dashed downstairs. She ran into the kitchen. And as she entered, what she saw is what I think you're expecting. The spider was now a man. And he spoke kindly to her, and they had breakfast together. They chatted as if nothing had happened. And even after breakfast, when they walked out onto the front steps of the palace and discovered that during the night, the palace had gradually descended down through the clouds until now it nestled at the base of a green valley. even then, he didn't remark on it. Their life went on as it always had. Their routines were intact. He was kind to her and pleasant. But you know, it's not the same, is it? Living in a palace made of marble at the base of a green valley. Once you've grown accustomed to living in a palace made of glass, high above the clouds. But I did tell you, didn't I, that she really was rather sorry. Actually, it's not a story you have to applaud, really. Now, I've always said this, that when I tell a story, I absolutely marvel at where you are. Oh, I mean, I know you're sitting at these tables in this room, but I have absolutely no idea where you are in your head. And it's possible that some of you fell fast asleep. I put a lot of teachers to sleep. I tell a lot of stories in schools, and sometimes I see the teachers nodding off, and I thought, that's good. They need that rest. I'll look after the kids, you sleep. That's fine by me. I'm not hurt by that, not injured by that. So if you went to sleep, I am quite pleased. I'm happy that you got the rest. You obviously needed it. But maybe you didn't go to sleep. I don't know. So this is the audience participation bit, and it's very, very gentle. All I want you to do is to think about where you were in your head while the story was being told. And if you fell asleep, that's your story, and that's honorably reportable. Okay? Or if you drifted in and out of the story because you've got some shopping to do this afternoon and you're trying to think of how you're going to organize everything, that's honorably reportable. So if you could just find an elbow partner, we're not going to take more than a minute. What were you aware of that was going on in your head while you were listening to the story? 1 minute, starting now. Okay, that's about 1 minute. Now, by the sounds of things, not everybody slept through the story. All right, is there anyone who feels sufficiently brave to tell us one thing that you were talking about when you were having this chat about what went on in your head? Anybody at all? I know this is a big room, but maybe somebody who feels bold can just shout out. What's something you talked about? Yes?
We thought we were almost visualizing it like we were in a movie. Yeah.
You were visualizing the story, picturing. How many of you found yourself at some point making pictures in your mind of the story? I'm just curious, did anyone notice what the girl was wearing? Did anybody see? She was naked? You didn't see what she was wearing? Oh, okay. Did anyone notice if the palace had turrets? Nobody saw turrets. Oh, you saw turrets, okay. Could somebody who feels sufficiently bold just describe one thing you saw in your mind as you listened to the story? Just one little thing. Yes, sir.
The snakes around her as she was playing her harmonica.
Ah, the snakes closing in and hissing. That's a powerful image, isn't it? I mean, that's certainly one that when the children draw this story, that's a picture I get a lot of her in the nest and the snakes stretching their heads towards her. Okay, is there anything else you talked about besides visualizing or picturing? Yes?
I spoke about in order for me to kind of borrow your story to retell it following the journey in my head.
You were trying to...
Follow the journey in my head so I can now borrow your story and use it.
Yeah, you're looking at the structure a little bit of this, how the story's built.
Exactly.
All right, paying attention to the architecture. So, now this is not a hard story to tell. It's actually quite easy to tell, and yet usually I say to people that stories with a very strong pattern are the easiest, but this is not a difficult one to tell. There is a kind of a pattern, isn't it? I mean, we start out, she is poised between heaven and earth, so to speak. And then suddenly she ascends and then she descends. So the story moves almost in a loop. So that's one. All right, so yeah, I'm sure there are others in here who might have been thinking, or they might have been thinking, I wonder if I dare tell this story. We're not going there. All right. Anything else that you talked about? So we've got visualizing the architecture.
I was really fearful through the story, maybe because it started with the snakes and so forth, and then the spider, and I just kept thinking about news items, current and so forth, of girls being captured and etc. And I just couldn't get that out of my head. I was really fearful that something was going to happen. Of course, I know you, and I didn't think that was going to happen, but
Well, you were anticipating
I
that.
was anticipating.
Yes, you were anticipating, you were predicting, where is this story going? What's going to happen to her? Did any of you find yourself trying to anticipate, where's this story going? How's it going to end? And maybe even trying to find an end for it. Sure. Anything else you talked about? Yes, sir.
I just had a sense of calm because I've had my coffee. I'm here on these fabulous rocking chairs, and your voice was just what I needed. And I just thought to myself, gee, Erica, you're not really following along with the story. Your auditory skills are horrible today. So I really had to try and focus on the content because I was just enjoying your voice so much.
So you're commenting on the performance a bit and how, yes, and you know, every single person is evaluating out there. Everybody's evaluating. When I'm working with 3- and 4-year-olds, I got about 30 seconds to grab them or they're back at the sand table, you know. So they're evaluating. Am I going to sit through this? Is this good enough? You know, is this interesting enough to hook me? And a lot of energy goes into this. Do I want to, you know, expel that kind of energy? Anything else you talked about? This is great. Yes?
While we were listening, we were noticing your word choice and the rich vocabulary, which would just take us out of the story for a moment and then bring us back in.
That's fascinating because I believe very strongly that the story on the breath is the most powerful experience a young person, well, any person can have with respect to noticing language. And if you want to model language, this is how you do it. I find it very interesting that children come up to me all the time and say, how come you never say or aw or you know? And I said, well, I guess it's because the flow of language comes the more you practice telling. But yes, we pay attention. And very often when children write captions in kindergarten and have to dictate that caption to somebody, I will find they will take phrases intact from the story and have either, if they can't get it down themselves, they will dictate that phrase. So you know, oh yes, they're paying attention. The language is meaningful. It's hooking them. They are hearing words. And the other thing is, stories have a kind of poeticized language. It's not quite the same as what we hear all the time. And that poeticized language has a rhythm and almost a spellbinding quality to it, doesn't it? Anything else you talked about? Yes?
How do you use the washroom in a clear castle? Like, no privacy.
Thank you. What she's just said is, I had questions in my head. How many of you found that there were questions coming unbidden into your minds? Anybody want to shout out a question? Larry,
How can you get a drape on the ceiling?
Okay. Anyone else?
How to support a nest on a branch and the snake can't go on it.
Okay, what else?
The snake's going to come back.
All right, what else?
How does the snake roll up rope between its legs?
The spider, okay.
I was just trying to imagine the size of this little girl.
Okay, so yes, we have all kinds of questions that a story raises. I think that the big question for me personally is, how on earth did she end up living in a tangly forest all by herself in a nest? Something has happened prior to the story. What was it? Was she banished? Exiled? Did she run away? Or is she just basically in her own backyard, which she thinks is a jungle and she's imagining all that? You know? So that's a huge question. What happened before? Another question that, that I have is, that the kids always ask me, what's her name? She doesn't have a name. What is it? Do you know her name? Well, no, I don't. Well, we have to find out. Well, do you want to give her a name? No, what is it? You know? So, and then there's that whole question. Is she a feral child who's been raised in the wilderness by wolves? I doubt it. I doubt it. In her nest are the trappings of civilization. Books, music, and the visual arts. This is not a feral child. This is a child who is well on the way to the development of her imagination. Anything else you talked about? Yes?
Yeah, actually, my sister is too shy to speak up for herself. But she was,
Well, maybe she will now.
she asked me.
Yeah, now that you centered her out.
She asked me to.
Oh, all right.
She was making connections to other texts, such as Pandora's Box and what else?
The Garden of Eden and Curiosity.
And I'm gonna bet that almost everybody in this room was whipping through their playlist, trying to figure out what story is this reminding me. Hands up if you thought of another story. You were trying to connect it. Well, what were you?
Well, the moment you said the word the glass castle, you took me back to the child in the glass castle in that book. And so many things I was just connecting with your story to the child in that book in the glass castle. With, I don't know how many of you read, but one of the really best book I ever read. But there is also the girl in the middle of that story. And who knows what was before.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? A book you were connecting to a story? Yes.
It's a book, Nation by Terry Pratchett, and it starts with a child stranded on an island. This whole world has been destroyed by some tidal wave or something. And I thought of that because how did she get into that truth?
Okay, anyone else? A story? Yes.
Jack and the Beanstalk, just with this place above the clouds where people live.
Okay. James, I was waiting for a Roald Dahl connection. Yes, James and the Giant Peach for sure. And what about Peter Pan? And what about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And what about The Wizard of Oz? And what about Alice in Wonderland? As we begin to get further, we begin to see that this story connects. And what about mythology? All of those stories of the tricksters who can change their shape. Anansi, Loki, you know, Raven, to mention a few. And then that whole notion of a tree that is suspended, and in Norse mythology, with who lives at the roots and who lives in the branches, and all of that kind. So yes, we can try to connect that to our playlist. So in other words, oh, I know one more thing. Did anybody find that you had a personal memory, something that you hadn't even thought about for years that just popped into your head that was triggered by the tale? Anything at all, personal memory. Is there anybody in this room who ever found out a secret before you were ready to understand it? My mother was reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when I was about 8 years old. I don't know if you've ever read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I'm not suggesting you rush out and get it, but I took it from her night table and I started to read it under the covers. I was not ready for sexual content. And I puzzled and puzzled. And when I put the book back on her night table, I really was rather sorry. So, anybody have, you were going to suggest something?
Well, I had a similar, I read Franz Kafka when I was about 11 or something. That was I read about the cockroach, waking up as a cockroach. That was pretty, that was a little over my head, but I also walked in once on a sexual act, a member of my family that was not my parents.
Yeah.
An uncle, but he didn't know. I just kept walking.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't know what was going on, but I was mystified and figured it out
Okay.
a little while later.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Yes?
When I'm telling a story, sometimes I'm asked, is it true? And I'll often say, it really doesn't matter to me whether it's biblical, whether it's true or not, but I'm interested in the message. But why then, to give that message, do I do that through something that appears biblical or not true?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we wrote this book called, This Book is Not About Drama. It's about ways to inspire students. But we're looking at the role of imagination in learning. And what is the teacher's role in the development of imagination? And what is the student's role in the development of imagination? And for me, a story like this is a story with a very rich subtext. It's a story that has all kinds of implications and other things. And so at this point, rather than try to answer questions, I would want to give the students opportunities to explore in their own way. Already, just by doing what we did, we've discovered how busy our minds were as we listened to that story. I didn't hear many people say, well, I went to sleep, although that was legitimate. That was okay to do. I didn't want to, say that you couldn't. But we were very busy, and so are our students, very busy in their heads. And I think the first thing that we need to do after a story is to allow them to think about what the story has triggered in their minds and imaginations. Too often, we take them away from that processing of their initial response to story. This is their initial response. And the more they do this, the more they become aware of what they are doing when they listen. Now, in this book is not about drama. We have a glossary at the back of the book of drama conventions. And if you're not familiar with drama, the conventions are like little power cells. They enable the students to engage in a way that is open-ended, but at the same time helps them to move forward with respect to coming up with ideas and suggestions for what might be going on in a story. So for example, with a story like this today, I might use a convention that we call collective role. And with collective role, it's a very non-threat way of role-playing with young people. So for example, this group could be a collective, okay? And I might assign them a role, and I might say to them, I'd like you to be the snakes in the story. And perhaps at this table, I might say, I'd like you to be the girl in the story. And this table, I'd like you to be the spider in the story. And then the idea here is that I will interview the various characters. Now, in collective role, because there's a collective, there's a group of you, if somebody can't think of what to say, there's always somebody who can. So I always say to the students, if you can answer something, go ahead. If you don't have anything to say, that's fine, that's all right. But it's a tremendously powerful activity because Our students have to not only listen to their own collective to sort of stay within the storyline, they've got to listen to what the other characters are saying so that the narrative that we are developing develops in harmony. And another thing the students are doing is they are listening in role. So what might I ask the students? Suppose, for example, I started with the snakes. I might say, the tree in which you appear to dwell is no ordinary tree. Can you tell me something about that tree? Well, interesting. What does that tree look like? So, once again, we dip into our imaginations. I might go to the spider and say, how did you become aware of the tree? That's not a church bell. That's my timer going off. And so by going back and forth and just asking a simple, oh, cut it out. All right, I'm coming. There. By going back and forth and just asking a simple question of each group, a new story is developing. And we're going deeper into the rich subtext of that tale. And the students are now in control of the shaping of the new story. And eventually I can get to what I think is one of the most important lines. To the girl, why were you sorry? And to the spider, did you lose by this or gain? Wow. I think I'll stop now. Thank you for being great listeners.